Welcome to week 6 of our course on forced and precarious labor in the global economy, slavery by another name. The subject for this week is commercial sex and the global economy. In previous weeks, my colleagues Joel and Sam have discussed how globalization has enabled the flow of trade and capital across the world, but that the migration of human beings across borders has been far more restricted. Giving in to nationalist sentiments on immigration, governments propose walls and strong borders. At the same time, governments support the labor needs of global corporations by entering into bilateral agreements with developing countries on the movement of labor. Migrants work under tight visas and have little or no labor law protections and few pathways to citizenship. Women experience the impact of such restrictive migration policies in quite unique ways. After all, historically speaking, women have migrated across borders for many forms of work: domestic work, factory work, and sex work. But soon after the processes of globalization were set into motion, women moved in greater numbers, threatening to produce dramatic shifts in power relations between the sexes. The response to this took the form of a sex panic. Governments and civil society actors alike raised alarm over what they viewed as the trafficking of women and children across international borders for prostitution. Reviving sensational stories of horror associated with what was called the white slave trade at the turn of the 20th century, governments became busy with drafting a new UN protocol, which was to supplement the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Calling the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, the text of the protocol and its implementation over the past 18 years have been fundamentally driven by the long-ranging sex work debates, namely, how should we think about the normative status of sex work? As you may be familiar, there are two main feminist positions in the sex work debates. One articulated by the radical feminists or neo-abolitionists, and the other by sex work feminists. I deal with each in turn. Now, for radical feminists, prostitution is not merely a discrete social phenomenon where women sell sex for money, but is instead paradigmatic of violence against women, one which conditions all violence against women. So, according to American radical feminist Andrea Dworkin, prostitution is at the bottom of the hierarchy of male supremacy. Rape, domestic battery, and sexual harassment all share with prostitution some statement or manifestation of sexual ownership, but they are not prostitution. In other words, prostitution is the worst form of violence. Now, for radical feminists, any form of sex work, whether it involves violence or not, is harm, the greatest harm being commodification. So, commodification itself is harmful, irrespective of the conditions under which sex workers commodify sex. According to them, there are two types of violence in sex work. One is the paid for violence of unwanted and painful penetration. And then there is the unpaid for violence, including rape, verbal abuse, beatings, a range of medical conditions, and psychological harms such as post-traumatic stress disorder. These harms, according to radical feminists, are irreparable. For them, the consent or agency of sex workers does not matter. And the distancing and dissociation in sex workers' lives may appear to us to be survival strategies, but in fact for them, they only think of it as sex workers' false consciousness. So quite predictably, for radical feminists, sex work cannot be work under any circumstances. Now coming on to sex work feminists, they believe that the boundary between commercial and non-commercial sexual relationships is neither sharp nor impermeable. In other words, prostitution cannot be ring-fenced when heterosexual relationships are often also economic relationships. Think about marriage, for instance. As for commodification, they claim all of us, except the independently wealthy and unemployed, take money for the use of our body. So for sex work advocates, the commodification of emotion is not inherently destructive, and workers can delineate their core selves from the labor that they perform. So for them, sex work is on par with emotional labor, such as airline service work, acting, psychotherapy, massage work, or childcare, as well as with labor involving bodily services, even those that are intimate, including wage work, domestic work, entertainment, university teaching, and being a colonoscopy artist, in the famous words of Martha Nussbaum. What therefore makes sex work harmful are the particular conditions under which it is performed, such as debt bondage, indentureship, and hyper-exploitative contractual arrangements. Exploitation within the sex industry thus finds parallels in other informal and unregulated sectors. For sex work advocates, the goal would therefore be to recognize sex work as work and seek its radical transformation, not its abolition. They ask us to respectfully recognize the subjectivity and personal agency of sex workers and dismiss the stigma and prejudice that fuels the popular imagination of sex work. Now, of course, you might say, this is all and well in the Western context, but what about the developing world with its high levels of poverty? Can one really assert sex worker agency in that context? In the documentary, The Tale of the Night Fairies, on the other hand, we find sex workers offering what I understand as a third position in the sex work debates, namely a materialist feminist theory of sex work. To begin with, third world sex workers reject problematic colonial era constructs of themselves as thoroughly disempowered and brutalized and victimized and infantilized or as passive. Instead, and you will see this in the supplementary readings where I include the Sex Workers Manifesto, Indian sex workers understand their sex work to be a form of reproductive labor performed under the severe constraints imposed by a capitalist patriarchal system. Sex work is one of the few options for a livelihood that they have. And they often come to sex work from other low-paid jobs in the informal economy, where sexual harassment is routine. They then begin to ask why not do sex work and at least get paid for the sexual favors that they have to give for free in other sectors. Sex workers also have a strong critique of marriage. How are sex workers different from women compelled into marriage for economic reasons, they ask. Thus, they assert their agency knowing fully well that their consent is constrained. So they're keen to be treated as dignified workers, not as victims who need to be rescued and rehabilitated by elite feminists. Now, central to these feminist positions is the role that they visualize for the law. And here, one could think of four major policy options for regulating sex work. These are prohibition or complete criminalization, where all aspects of sex work are criminalized. And here, since the sale of sex is criminalized, sex workers can also be prosecuted under this system. The second option is abolition or partial decriminalization, where all aspects of sex work are criminalized, but not the sale of sex. So sex workers cannot be prosecuted, but customers can be. We then have a third option, complete decriminalization, where any special anti-sex work criminal law is repealed, leaving sex work to be regulated by the general criminal law. So buyers and sellers of sex can continue to be prosecuted, say for obscenity or public nuisance. And then we have the fourth option, legalization, where in addition to the repeal of the anti-sex work criminal law, we have special rules regulating sex work. And this can take different forms. So you have the Dutch model where municipalities issue licenses for sex work under local laws, or you have the New Zealand case, which allows sex workers to work in small groups, but the law has provisions to protect public health. Or you have the German case, where contracts for the sale of sex are legal and backed up by access to employment benefits. So which of these options do radical feminists and sex work feminists pursue? Radical feminists have faith in the criminal law, and they believe that criminal law can work, but only if it is enforced by the state. Criminal law should, however, according to them, only target the true offenders, customers, pimps, traffickers, but not the sex workers themselves. The Swedish model of criminalizing customers of sex workers in particular has gained popularity across the world. Thus, radical feminists advocate for partial decriminalization or abolition. Sex workers, meanwhile, oppose prohibition and partial decriminalization because they believe that any kind of criminalization translates into increased costs for sex workers, irrespective of who is actually punished. Essentially, it means that sex workers have to do more sex work or do sex work under pretty difficult conditions. If sex work were instead decriminalized, then sex workers would be better off. This is especially true for third world sex workers, because often for them, the state simply means the brutal, corrupt police officer down the road who routinely extracts bribes and sexual favors from them in order to refrain from using the anti-sex work criminal law against them. Moreover, sex workers all over the world are generally wary of state interference over sex work, so they tend to prefer decriminalization over legalization. So, what has all this got to do with our fight against trafficking and modern slavery? In the early years after the adoption of the Trafficking Protocol, governments routinely conflated trafficking with trafficking for sex work and with sex work itself. So governments could claim to fight trafficking simply by proposing a stringent Swedish-style anti-sex work criminal law. Eventually, however, they began to define trafficking in terms of Article 3 of the Palermo Protocol, which does not deal solely with sex work or trafficking for sex work. Now, formally, although many countries define trafficking to cover sectors beyond sex work to include labor trafficking, in reality, anti-trafficking law is used disproportionately against sex workers, rendering them collateral damage in more ways than one. So how can sex workers resist this use of anti-trafficking law while continuing to work against exploitative work practices within sex work? This is the subject of the session in week 7 convened by my colleague Elena Shi.